While the wealthy guests laughed at the dirty gardener during this multi-million-dollar wedding, no one realized he was actually the one who owned the entire estate. But what happened when he finally took off his cap left the groom, his own son, speechless. They called him the poor gardener long before anyone learned his name. He moved through the wedding like a shadow that smelled of earth and rain, hands nicked, shirt the color of well-worn burlap, a cap pulled low to shade his face. While ladies adjusted gloves and gentlemen straightened ties, he knelt in the beds and ran his fingers through the soil, coaxing roses into bloom as if they were shy children. No one thought to ask where he had come from. In a place full of guests who measured worth by cufflinks and carriage lists, a man with dirt on his knuckles was simply scenery. The garden itself had been chosen like a painting. Long lawns that rolled toward a glass house, beds of heirloom roses, lanterns that would hang like low stars when dusk came. The tables were set with ivory linens and silver that reflected faces polished by anticipation. Laughter rose in circles, champagne glinted in flutes. Beneath the clinking and the rehearsed smiles lay the kind of brittle etiquette that comes with money and the expectation of being admired. Sarah moved through those circles with a different kind of precision. She wore the black of the catering staff, an apron tied around her waist, hair pinned back in a way that made her tired eyes look purposeful rather than weary. Her daughter, Molly, had been dropped off with a neighbor for the afternoon. Sarah's shifts were long, and every extra hour she picked up paid for two things: the small apartment 3 blocks from the train and the tuition from Molly's dance class. Sarah had hands that could steady a tray or soothe a toddler's bump. Her resume had more stamps than titles, and every word she spoke carried the economy of someone who measured risks and affection the way she measured portions, carefully. It was Sarah who noticed the gardener first, when a trickle of men in suits pointed him out with half smiles and raised eyebrows. The comments were soft but sharp. He shouldn't be in the rose beds. Didn't we hire someone else for the garden? How quaint! The garden staff, some hired, some volunteers, shifted uncomfortably as whispers moved like a ripple across the lawn. Guests in hats exchanged glances as if the man's presence might inconvenience the photo op. He did not look up when they whispered. He knelt by a patch of lavender and, with a motion as quiet as breath, pruned a dead stem. He worked like someone who understood that small things mattered. It was in the way he pressed dirt back around roots, in the way he adjusted a trellis not because anyone told him to, but because it would make the roses lean better for the bride's entrance. Chuckling voices followed him. Vivian, thin, lacquered fingernails, said something about out-of-place help and was met with a grin from Charlotte, who wore pearl after pearl like a string of small defenses. Amanda, assigned to guest coordination, scoffed and tutted as she passed him. These were women whose days had been trained to detect social trespasses. A man with rough hands and patched trousers did not belong between champagne and a bouquet. Across the lawn, Harold watched from the edge of the herb bed. Harold was the legitimate head groundskeeper, gray-haired, hands like gnarled roots, the kind of man who had been tending that estate since before the groom knew how to tie his tie. He had seen seasons, weddings, and the slow erosion of pride into entitlement. He looked at the newcomer with an expression that mixed curiosity and a kind of cautious welcome. "Don't pay them no mind," he told the gardener in a voice like gravel softened by long usage. "They'll learn the roses don't bloom from gossip." They spoke little. The gardener answered in short phrases, with a care that felt less like rehearsed politeness and more like a habit of treating people as if they were small gardens themselves, needing tending, not trimming. Sarah first noticed him properly when, 5 minutes before the bride arrived, one of the decorative carts toppled. A heavy candelabrum pitched forward, sending glass beadwork and a smattering of petals across the stone path. A shriek, high and immediate, came from the edge of the setup, where a tray of hors d'oeuvres had caught and flipped. A woman in silver dress stumbled, grazing an elbow. The flurry of reaction was immediate. Photographers hesitated. A manager barked orders into a headset. A flustered host waved hands as if to smooth a wrinkle in the sky. Sarah stepped in without thinking. Her hands moved as they always did, steadying the tray, picking up scattered pieces, offering a cool smile that meant, "I can do this." She had a small, practical competence that did not wait for permission. She offered the shaken guest water and an apologetic glance that said, "Have I done what I can?" From the corner of her eye, Sarah saw the gardener kneel and catch the small cloud of falling petals, tucking them back into place as if apologizing to the flowers themselves. Then he rose and, with a movement almost invisible, steadied the candelabrum with one hand while he righted the cart with the other. Guests clapped as if a magician had performed. The manager called out a terse "good" and went on to bark into his headset. Sarah's hands were still damp from handling the tray. She wiped them on her apron and met the gardener's eyes. For a moment she saw not the dirt but a reflection, calloused, patient, and kind. He nodded once and returned to the roses as if he had never left. There are small humanity tests in every gathering.
A tray falls, a child cries, someone's heel breaks on a path. Tiny emergencies where the true temperature of people shows through. For Sarah, whose life was a sum of these quiet crises, the world often looked like an exam hall where compassion was the only currency she had that never devalued. She had learned, painfully, that the people who needed kindness rarely had a seat at the front. She did what she could, and the universe, uneven as it was, sometimes returned favors in the form of overtime. Across the hedgerow, in a small, curtained tent that smelled faintly of peppermint and leather, a man in a gray suit and a fine watch spoke in low tones to a companion. The room was intentionally dim. It was where the groom's party finished their ties and checked their breath. The man's name was Arthur Langley. Well off enough that his name carried with it rooms and doors that everyone else had to ask to enter. He had come to the wedding with a plan nested inside another plan, to walk unnoticed among the guests and watch. He had asked for an ordinary jacket, gloves, and a pair of practical boots. He had said that he wanted to know how people treated those beneath them. David, his friend and longtime advisor, sat across the table polishing the groom's cufflinks, as if that would calm them both. David's face carried the look of someone who had been asked to witness something about to happen, an accomplice to a test of hearts. "You sure about all this?" David asked in a voice that balanced curiosity and caution. Arthur tapped the edge of his glass. "My son knows the city's streets and the stock tickers. He knows numbers. He doesn't seem to know how to be seen by the people who aren't on his guest list." There was no theatrical bitterness in Arthur's words, only a tired longing. "I want to see if the people who will stand closest to him are the ones who will kneel when someone falls." David sat back. "And if they don't?" Arthur's hands, for a moment, showed the only crack in his composure. "Then at least I'll know." There was a hand like a question shaking in his throat, one that had been smoothed by the exacting craft of business and seemed new at the task of asking for a human answer. It was easier to decide to test hearts when you could hide behind a suit. It was harder when you had to face the fact that such tests could change more than you could foresee. Arthur's plan was a small, unromantic thing: become a gardener, stay in the background, and see. He would, later, reveal himself. He had not told his son, of course he had not. Hesitation and secrecy were part of the measuring. For the guests, this garden was all about appearances. For Arthur, it was an experiment. For Sarah, it was an afternoon where the small acts might mean food on the table that week. None of them knew the same things. None of them had read the same map. As the bride's car turned into the long driveway, the wind picked up for a breath and carried the scent of rosemary. The assembled guests moved as a single constellation toward the glass house, their faces bright with the glow of expectation. The musicians tuned. Someone adjusted a microphone, though no one wanted anyone to speak of commitment in a tone that sounded mechanical. The priest, well practiced in 100 ceremonies, checked the script and smiled at rehearsed tears. Cameras clicked into place like wing beats. The gardener stayed on the periphery, hands in the soil, watching. He found small ways to be present without intruding, tying a stray ribbon that hung awkwardly on an arbor, sweeping the steps at the entrance. He offered a quiet word to Harold as they crossed paths, and Harold gave a short, approving grunt. "Good hands," Harold said, not as praise, but as fact. Sarah, who had been swallowed in the bustle, found herself pulled to the edge of the ceremony for a moment to tie a bow or steady a child's shoe. When Molly had been smaller, she had carried her 100 times across the same patchwork of apartment floors, and she knew the importance of steadying the small things. A woman in a designer dress bumped against her side. The woman's hat brushed the apron's fabric and did not notice the small stain that lingered on Sarah's sleeve. Sarah smiled anyway, because it was the quickest currency of peace. Not every glance was unkind. Mr. Wilson, the honcho of guest logistics, an ordinary man who loved his work more than the title it gave him, watched the gardener with a look of practical curiosity. "He's doing fine," Mr. Wilson said to Amanda as she fussed over a seating plan. "No harm in an extra pair of hands." Amanda's reply was a short, dismissive glance. "We did not staff a gardener. We hired professionals." "You ever seen a bloom stand straighter because a man frowned?" Mr. Wilson asked. The question hung between them like a pebble tossed into a still pond. Amanda walked away, lips pinched. Her duties were important to her. She took pride in an order that left no room for improvisation. Then the small emergency happened. A child, 10, maybe 11, ran past the tables, chased by another, shrieking with the unmodulated joy that children carry. He clutched a small family heirloom, a brooch pinned to a ribbon he had found in the reception tent. The brooch had been the subject of a story told in 100 ways that afternoon. A grandmother's treasure, the last thing to be handed down through generations, the object that made a woman remember the first time she smelt rain. The boy, thrilled with the attention, wove between ankles and set a course that cut through the herb bed. Something caught, a shoe on a root, a heel tucked under a stone, and the boy pitched forward. The brooch flew from his hands, spinning like a small comet, and landed with a thin metallic plink beneath a low arch of wrought iron. It fell into the shadow of a shallow fountain and disappeared beneath glassy water.
For a fraction of a second, there was silence, like the held breath before an avalanche. The mother screamed, a high silver string of panic, and hands reached out toward the faint splash. The groom's uncle muttered, "This is our heirloom," and someone looked near the fountain and frowned. The manager, already fraying at the edges from scheduling, set his jaw. "We cannot delay the procession for a child's accident," he said into his headset, as if the words were a shield. "The schedule is everything. Keep the service on time." Time, for the people waiting to be married, was a line to be followed. For the boy and his family, a lost brooch was a heartache raw enough to steal attention from vows. The manager's eyes did not soften. He had been taught that a show must go on. Harold, who had been sweeping near the fountain, bent down and peered into the water. The metal blinked back from the dark bottom like a hidden eye. He reached for a net and worked to fish it out, but the angle was tricky. Guests leaned over the edge and peered, faces contorted in combinations of pity and boredom. Amanda stomped her heel and demanded we follow protocol. Call maintenance. Call the maintenance crew and schedule retrieval at 12 after the ceremony. That was policy. Sarah could not stand by and hear the scheduling of a child's grief.
She moved closer, the practical muscle of her arms ready to do what needed to be done. People part like water around someone with purpose. She found a small garden spade and knelt by the edge, hands steady as she used it to move the stones, to clear the tangle of roots that lay in the way. Harold muttered an unprintable and handed her the net. The gardener came up behind them, standing near enough that his breath fogged the hem of her apron. He did not speak at first. He watched the water, the brooch, the boy's body curled like an animal. Then, with a steadiness that felt like an answer, he reached in and, without ceremony, lifted the brooch out of the water with his bare hands and set it on the parched grass like a small, shining offering. The boy sobbed and clutched it to his chest. The mother wept openly. Guests shuffled, uncertain at the sudden wave of real emotion that had broken through the varnished surface of their afternoon. But not everyone's face turned tender. Vivian sneered, loud enough for a few to hear. "At least they can find lost things," she said, voice thin and sharp. "Is that his job too?" Her words were a small, precise weapon. People laughed, brittly. The manager cleared his throat in annoyance, because the disruption made everything harder to control. The gardener turned his head toward Vivian. He did not offer a retort. He simply wiped his hands on his trousers and handed the brooch back to the boy. His manner was quiet, without a hint of triumph or shame. To Sarah, it looked almost biblical, an act stripped of commentary, just a hand offering what had been lost.
In that moment, the whole tapestry of class and pretense boiled down to a small exchange of metal and moisture-streaked cheeks. Several guests whispered that the gardener had done the right thing for attention. A few shook their heads, convinced he was showing off. Mr. Wilson, however, crossed the lawn and clapped the gardener on the shoulder. "Thoughtful," he said. "Good eye." In the minutes that followed, as the crosshairs of the ceremony reset and the musicians lifted their bows again, a new current ran beneath the polite conversation. Who was the man in the patched jacket? Rumors took the place of answers. Probably a volunteer, someone decided. A relative of the gardener on staff, another answered. The rumor mill chewed and spit out the same tired hypothesis. He was nothing worth more than a footnote. Sarah was tired and small in an ocean of silk, but something about the gardener's ease tugged at a part of her that was used to guessing people's motives by the weight of their hands. They spoke, finally, in a corner arranged by chance, Harold, Sarah, and the gardener, where the lavender bent and the path led to the gardener's shed. "You from round here?" Harold asked. "Not exactly," the man said. His voice had the kind of texture that fit with his hands, steady and low. He did not say more than he needed. "You good with water?" Harold asked, not for novelty, but for a fact. "Used to keeping what's fallen from being lost," the gardener replied. The line was neither confession nor boast. It was the kind of answer given by anyone who has spent time repairing small things. Sarah bent her head and picked at the hem of her apron. "Thank you," she said to him, and meant it without the softeners that sometimes seasoned gratitude with social armor. He nodded and touched the sprig of rosemary tucked behind his ear, an odd and human thing, then reached for his small lunch, a roll wrapped in wax paper, and a thermos of tea. He offered a half to Sarah without asking. It was bread and boiled cabbage, and the sort of simple comfort you find in lunchrooms where people earn their days with grease on their sleeves. She accepted. They sat on the stone edge and ate in companionable silence. The conversation between them was the kind that fills in the outline of a person, rather than drafting a portrait. Where your feet have carried you, what storms you have seen. Sarah told him, in small details, about Molly's dance classes, how the boy she taught at the community center loved pretending to be a knight, how the rent always came a week late unless she worked overtime. She did not ask for charity. She shared in the way people hand others a map of where they came from. The gardener offered a word of counsel about the roses, about pruning in the cool of the day rather than midday heat. They're stubborn in the way some people are. You don't cut too fierce, you wait for the season. It was an observation that sounded like advice for life as well as for plants. As they ate, Sarah felt a small, unapologetic relief in being seen. Not the kind advertised in glossy magazines, the fleeting pleasure of a compliment, but the quieter kind, someone noticing you for the work of your hands. She realized, too, that kindness did not always arrive in envelopes or in grand gestures. Sometimes it came as a shared sandwich in the shade of a hedge. The ceremony began again. Voices swelled into the vows, and the air took on the solemn softness of promises. The gardener returned to his paths. Sarah slipped back into the service, apron tucked into the folds of a dress she had smudged with flour earlier in the day. She watched the couple exchange words about fidelity and love that hung in the air between them like soap bubbles, beautiful and fragile. All the while, Arthur watched from an angle where he could see faces without drawing notice. He had chosen the spot carefully, between a boxwood and an ornamental pear tree, where the sun would not highlight him. He felt the odd exhilaration of being invisible in a crowd he had once ruled with a name. He listened to the murmurs and the kindness and the cruelty, and he took them down like notes. What he did not expect was the way the gardener and Sarah became a quiet axis in the afternoon, not because they were dramatic, far from it, but because their small, unadorned interactions formed a contrast against the brittle decorum. Arthur felt something unravel in him when he watched Sarah hand her apron to a colleague with a tired smile after the ceremony, and the gardener bend to replant a root as if restoring the world in miniature. When the guests moved to the reception area, full of flourishes and remotes and menus printed on heavy paper, the gardener stayed near the hedgerows, hands dirty, eyes kind. He was a man whose presence was both too ordinary and too rich to be ignored. Sarah, finishing her shift, paused for a moment on the path and watched him. She felt gratitude and the faint prick of envy, if that could be named, in seeing how freely he moved between the lower and higher worlds without the borders that kept her in one. Somewhere among the tall tents, the older guests discussed legacies and social capital. The younger guests posed for photos with filters on their faces. Vivian told a story about having to get a table next to the silverware display when she had been a bridesmaid in a long-ago marriage. Pride, like a vine, scaled the stones of the afternoon, creeping where it could. The gardener straightened a statue and found, tucked beneath its base, a small envelope. It contained a card, a note of sincere thanks from a recent wedding party. He smiled and stuffed it into his jacket. It was not currency in the way others counted currency, but it was the kind of recognition that felt like a small, private sun. In the distance, thunder muttered, an odd, sullen sound.
No one seemed to notice at first. Conversations were thick with after-ceremony relief. But clouds were gathering like a forethought, linen stirring in an anxious wind. A breeze whispered through the garden, and the lanterns clinked softly, like a warning before sleep. Amanda saw it and hurried to the manager. "Weather forecasts say no rain," she said, fat fingers tapping at her phone. "We must not let the schedule slip. If it rains, it will mess up the photos, the seating, everything." The manager nodded, tightening a jaw muscle. For some, storms were measured in dollars lost to canceled photographs. Harold, who had been listening from his bench with the weathered patience of someone who had weathered storms more literal than schedule conflicts, looked up at the sky. "Sometimes," he said to no one, "the sky decides for itself. We can't make it polite." The first fat of rain fell, not enough to stop music, but enough to make people glance upward. The air shifted. A hush came over the lawn like the inhalation before the first word of a hymn.
Then, as if the afternoon had been waiting for an undoing, an older woman stumbled near the dessert table. She clutched her chest, no dramatic fall, and then, like a bell, doubled over. Her face drained color. The murmurs intensified. "Heart," someone whispered, and the words snagged across the lawn like a hook. Sarah was closer than most. She rushed forward, hands ready. The manager, code-driven and panicked, looked around for a nurse and for directions to an emergency kit. Amanda called security. The gardener was there too. He crouched next to the woman and spoke in a voice like water over stones, calm, measured. He lifted her wrist to check for pulse, then turned to get a bottle of water. The woman's eyes fluttered. She was breathing, but shallow. The groom's cousin yelled for an ambulance. The manager, thinking of PR and timing, barked for someone to manage the crowd. This, finally, was the real test. In the face of immediate need, who would step forward and who would step back? Would people follow protocol, insisting on calls and managers and waiting for authorization? Or would they take the risk of defying schedules and offering hands without asking for permission? Sarah knelt. She placed her hand on the woman's shoulder and murmured, "You're okay, we'll get you help." Her voice was steady but small, like someone speaking to a child at night. The gardener handed her a folded cloth to press to the woman's lip and fetched a satchel Harold pointed out with a green cross. From the edge of the scene, Vivian stepped back and folded herself away, saying something about theatrics. A few guests clucked about the ceremony. Another guest, reputable, high on confidence, declared it was an inconvenience. But Mr.
Wilson, whose life had taught him that decisions were sometimes made by the people with the quickest hearts rather than the biggest titles, stepped forward and barked orders to security. "Call an ambulance now and get her to shade." As the rain came down a little harder, the lawn turned glossy and the white of the linens became perpetually wet. The first crisis had been the lost heirloom. The second was now a real human frailty. In the middle of it, a man with soil in his nails and a woman in an apron who had fried 100 scallops looked like the ones closest to the truth. Arthur watched it all from his cover among the hedges. He felt a small, complicated swell in his chest. He did not know what he would do when this was over, what judgment he would make, what hand he would extend. He simply watched, his plan unfolding in the way a gardener watches a seedling push through the soil, sometimes with faith, sometimes with hands ready to protect. He knew that certain moments change people. He was not blind to the cost of finding out the truth. For the guests, this was a diversion from elegance. For Sarah, it was another day's work. For the gardener, it was a demonstration of the kind of life that had cramped his boots a long time ago. For Arthur, it was a chance to see the configuration of true hearts, those who leaned forward when the music stopped. No one else knew yet who would stand up and who would shame themselves by stepping back. The ceremony hung suspended, an unfinished arc. The rain would either wash off the day's pretense or merely add a glossy sheen to a brittle surface. Pressed the cloth to the woman's forehead, the gardener supporting the woman's back. Harold set the satchel on a nearby chair, hands moving like they had moved in storms before. The voices around them softened and frayed. Somewhere a camera kept clicking, as if to keep a record that would outlive the way people behaved. It was in this rain-softened pause that the gardener looked at Sarah for a beat longer than politeness required. Their eyes met and carried a language too simple for the social dances around them. No promises were made. No fortunes were exchanged, only the recognition that in a world that bowed to appearances, the small acts of tending could change the course of a single afternoon, and perhaps in time, more. They did not know then which of their actions would become the hinge on which the rest of the day turned.
They could only act in small, human ways and see what happened next. If this opening grabbed you, tap like now and stay with the story a little longer. The ambulance came and went like a solemn moth. Its lights receded, and the woman was left in the capable hands of the groom's family, escorted gently to a car with a blanket and promises that sounded like someone trying to stitch calm over a jagged place. The guests, flushed and damp from the sudden rain, drifted back toward the tents with a new, quieter air.
Conversations resumed, but with a different rhythm, less show, more small, cautious concern. Minutes turned into an hour. The garden, now rinsed and bright, smelled of clean soil and wet roses. The dessert table dripped in the soft light. A hush had settled over the guests, not quite reverence, but a new, more watchful tone. People who a little while before had been measuring one another's jewels found the measure of a man's hands compelling in a way cufflinks never were. Arthur moved through the reception with an ease built by practice. He liked to watch rather than to be watched. He noticed subtleties, the way a child tried to climb onto a lap and was gently put down, the way a waiter steadied a tray with an apology before the guest could complain. He took careful mental notes. He had come to test more than the staff. He had come to test the network of people who would surround his son for the rest of his life. He watched Sarah, too, how she moved without taking up space, how she offered help like a small, steady light. The gardener drifted between the hedgerows and the nearer shadows, hands occasionally burying in soil, occasionally straightening a napkin, an instinct to make the world orderly by the smallness of his motions. He wasn't trying to be seen, that was the point. Still, when he passed a cluster of guests who had yet to be humbled by the day's events, a few eyes followed him with an irritation that felt like ownership. How dare the scenery take up so much compassion? Sarah went back to her work with the same patience as before, but something altered. She carried a small confidence, like a stone tucked in her pocket, a warmth from being noticed, not for what she might profit, but for what she offered. She found Harold sweeping the path and offered to help with the leaves that the rain had pulled from the maple. "You did well," Harold said, and in his voice was the rarest of praise, not a ledger note, but an acknowledgment, like an opening of a gate. That evening, the groom, James, stood with a glass of champagne and a face lined with the soft tremor of a man who had walked across vows and found himself swaying. He thanked a few necessary crowds, mouthed acknowledgments to a camera that would later print smiles in a more controlled light. Arthur watched his son watch everyone. He caught the brief worry in James's eyes when the guests shuffled into their places. James had not known his father's test. He moved through the evening the way someone walks through a house that is partly familiar, partly new. The dance floor opened, and a ribbon of music folded the guests in. People who had stood stiff as candlesticks now loosened like reeds in wind. Laughter came easier. Someone challenged another to a clumsy waltz. The gardener stood aside, hands clasped behind his back, watching the scene with a gentle, almost amused attention. He had the look of someone who knew the secret of a good party. It is not who you are, but how you tend one another in it. The hurt came later, in a corner lit by fairy lights and stubborn shadows. Sarah had agreed to a momentary break and sat on a low wall near the fountain, breath fogging in the slight chill. Molly's picture sat in her phone. She scrolled and smiled, the way a small private radiance finds its way into a busy night. She thought of the tuition that week, of a rent notice with a deliberate calm, and felt the old habitual ache. That was when she noticed the gardener approaching with something kept close to his chest. "Found you this morning," he said, handing her a scrap of paper, a small card with an address and a name. On it was a line that made her pause. The Langley Foundation, Community Partners. It was stamped with the sort of emblem that made social ladders feel slippery underfoot. She blinked at it as if it were a trick. "You okay?" Harold called from behind the roses. The gardener nodded and turned away, leaving Sarah with the card in her palm. Curiosity and confusion tangled into a small, sharp knot. She had shared pieces of her life with him, enough to feel seen. She had trusted him with a sandwich and a laugh, with the bare outlines of a life that was both ordinary and complicated. The card felt like an unspoken question. Who did she think he was? Had she been merely a confidant to a stranger who was testing her kindness? For an instant, a coldness rose up, not from grievance at being observed, but at the sense of having been a person in an experiment without consent. She searched the gardener's face, soft in the lantern light, hands rough as ever, eyes that had the kind of sorrow that could be lived in for a long time, and found nothing in it that read theatricality. "What is this?" she asked quietly, not to Harold, but to the air they shared. The gardener's reply was low. "Just a thing I carry." His voice had the same steady grain as before, no flourish, no puff of pretension. "You looked like you could use it." "Use it?" Sarah repeated. She felt small and slightly foolish for the sting that flared in her. Are you connected to them?" She meant the foundation, the names, the world that had seemed distant as a weather report. The question came out like a pebble into a pond. The gardener did not answer immediately. "There are different ways to help," he said finally. "Sometimes one starts where one stands." His words were enough to generate another way to feel, gratitude braided with the odd tang of embarrassment. Sarah's first urge was to be indignant. She had lived by matching hands to needs, not by bargaining for expressions. She had imagined their conversation as mutual, not transactional. Now she wondered if her kindness had been a specimen in a private study. The thought stung, because trust had a price she'd already paid in too many small ways.
She looked at him and saw that he was not playing a role with a flourish. There was a fatigue that came from someone used to walking between two worlds. "Does James know?" she asked, soft and accusatory and not fully wanting the answer. "No," he said. "He shouldn't need to." The line was a soft thing. He meant it to be protective, but it landed heavy on her chest. "It's for me to decide who to look at." Sarah folded the card and slid it into her pocket. "I don't like being looked at like a problem," she said, the words not accusatory so much as a small, hard reality. "I wanted to be a person he could count on." She let the sentence float and then tried to soften it. "I'm grateful for whatever help he wants to give, but I don't want it because you felt sorry for me." The gardener's face shifted. For the first time that night, he allowed a flash of something like apology. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to turn you into a test." It was not the apology she wanted. She wanted the truth, plain and immediate. "Are you who I think you are?" But his refusal to answer also had weight. He had kept his secret intentionally, and now she felt like she had been marked without consent. Later, when he thought she had gone back to work, the gardener sat under a pear tree and watched the swings of light from lanterns. Arthur walked up beside him like an old friend joining someone in a small vigil. "How are you holding up?" Arthur asked, using a voice that folded the two men into a familiar pattern. The gardener shrugged. "Sometimes you dig and don't know if you're making a garden or a grave," he said. "Tonight felt like a chance to see what grows when we don't stand in front of each other." Arthur's smile was brief. "You did well." "It was small work. That's my comfort." The gardener's hands toyed with a twig. His eyes were tired in a way that could be mistaken for resignation. Arthur looked at him longer. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "For what? The pluck of the boy? The old woman?" The gardener's question was rhetorical. "Because it's what I do. Because I know what it is to be overlooked. Because it's honest." Arthur nodded. There was a long silence, a pause where years and disagreements and a man's longing sat between them. "I wanted to watch," Arthur said finally. "I wanted to see what people become when they think no one important is watching." "You don't have to explain."
the gardener said, and there was a hint of weariness that suggested the question was old as his sentiment. You see what you want to see, I see what I need to be. A week later, a photograph from the wedding would circulate quietly among the staff, a candid of the gardener on his knees, holding the brooch between two fingers like something sacred. It would be printed and taped to a backroom bulletin board. Some would call it dignity, others would mutter about theater. The photograph did nothing to solve Sarah's tenderness at being quietly observed.
The card in her pocket was a talisman she did not yet know how to hold. That evening, as the toasts came and the groom prepared to say a few words, an expectant hush settled over the crowd. The music faded, and the groom moved toward the small stage with the unsteadiness of someone whose voice might try to carry more than a vow. He spoke of love, of family, of futures, and the guests applauded with the polite force of a well-trained audience. Arthur stood then, not the groom, not the staff, but the man who had lived long enough to know that moments like these demanded a certain courage. He cleared his throat in a way that snapped attention. The groom blinked at him, startled but not displeased. Arthur had always had the right to interrupt. "I've been a gardener today," Arthur said, and the words fell into the hush like seed into earth. The guests laughed uncertainly. The joke landed wrong in some places. He smiled and let the laugh die. "Not because I wanted to be dramatic, because I needed to see." Eyes turned. Some faces were brittle with impatience. Others, especially among the staff, looked up with an unreadable mix of curiosity and careful hope. "I wanted to see who loves people when there's no reward, who would bend to pick up a lost thing for a child, who would kneel by someone who fell, who would do work without applause." The camera lights blinked. A few phones lifted. He spoke of a lost brooch found by a man in a patched jacket and of a woman in an apron who refused to let a child's grief be scheduled away. He told the story in a voice that was both narrative and confession. His words reached Sarah like a stone that first skips, then falls true. "And this man," Arthur said, gesturing toward the gardener, who now stood with his hands folded, steady as a post, "has done more than plant roses today. He has reminded us all of something easily forgotten: dignity." A rustle ran through the crowd. Vivian's lips tightened, Amanda's jaw clenched. Some guests exchanged looks that said this was a performance, but Arthur's tone was not theatrical. It felt like the unbuttoning of a truth. "I have a confession," Arthur said. The confession came like a small drumbeat. Voices drew inward. "I am that man." The statement landed with a sound like glass. The room for a moment became a single bead of breath. People looked at him with a new, stunned certainty. Arthur removed his jacket, revealing not a gardener's coat, but a jacket that would have cost more than a month's rent for many present. He had been the gardener, all along. There were several reactions at once. Laughter, the sharp intake of guests who felt betrayed by a tease, a few who smiled with relief because the mystery was solved. The gardener, who for all intents and purposes had simply been himself, stood revealed. He was not a caricature of humility. He was an ordinary man with extraordinary decisions. James, the groom, froze.
His brow furrowed with an expression that mixed amusement, confusion, and a flicker of something like wounded surprise. "Dad?" he said, the word naked and ordinary in the middle of a crowd. Arthur looked at his son with a softness that made some in the audience shift in their seats. "I wanted to see who would care for the people around us," he said. "I wanted to know if my son's life would be lived near people who would bend down when others needed it." The revelation hit the proudest guests hardest. Vivian's smile collapsed into something thinner, a little embarrassed. Amanda, who had relied on protocol as her moral scaffolding, flushed as if remembering every instance she had said policy like a prayer. Arthur did not gloat. He spoke of the barnacles that grow on families when money is mistaken for character. He told the guests that public life was made up of the private acts of people who chose service over posture. Then he turned and addressed the staff in a different, quieter way. "To the staff here," Arthur said, "and to the woman who stopped a child's grief from being scheduled away, Sarah, thank you. You show what true stewardship looks like.
I want to bless that service, and I want to make amends where I have stood distant." He produced a small stack of envelopes and a piece of paper. The envelopes were not crass gestures, they were written with care. He announced that he would establish a small fund to ensure staff had access to dependable pay, to training, and to childcare support. He spoke of a scholarship he wanted to fund for employees' children, and of an endowment to finance training for staff who wanted to move into managerial roles. He made these announcements with a tone that avoided fanfare, but was deliberate and practical. The staff behaved with the cautious politeness of people who had learned to receive with restraint. Sarah's hands tightened around the edge of her pocket where the Langley Foundation card rested. She found herself unexpectedly on the edge of a decision. She could accept the help as a neat fix, aid wrapped in the bow of a public announcement, or she could insist on terms that preserved dignity. Arthur watched Sarah then, and whatever his hope had been shifted into action. He walked across the lawn, the lanterns leaving brief halos around his head, and stopped before her. "You need not take it now," he said gently. "I only want to offer it if it honors you." His voice had the effect of lowering a barrier. Sarah looked up into a face she now knew had many portions of life contained in it. She took a breath and said what she had been holding back. "I don't want to be charity. If you want to help people be able to stand. Help make work pay. Help make sure the next kid who loses a brooch gets it back without their family's head being counted as an inconvenience." Arthur's eyes crinkled, and something like a laugh softened his features. "That's fair," he said.
"I can do the practical things. I'm a businessman. I understand measurable change. I will fund what you have asked for: better pay and reliable hours, childcare help, education funds. I will also ask that the staff have a seat at our planning table when events are scheduled. Policy will no longer be the only voice." The crowd murmured. It was not grandiose, it was not an instant miracle. It was structural and thus slow, but honest. It was the kind of assistance that made room for human dignity. Vivian, overhearing, flushed, and then, in a small movement that surprised both Sarah and the guests, approached. She offered an apology that was quiet, not a broadcast. "I was rude," she said, and the words were simple and steady. "I'm sorry." Amanda's face was a complex thing, reluctant humility folding into something like curiosity. "We can do better," she admitted, in a voice that sounded like someone discovering a new workplace ethic. Mr. Wilson, who had been steady and unafraid of practical kindness, was praised openly. He shrugged like a man who had been doing what he thought was right. "Just common sense," he said. "We treat each other like people." The conversation that followed was not perfect. Some guests grumbled privately, insulting the gesture as theater, but the larger arc of the evening tilted. More than a few warm conversations took place in the quiet corners of the garden, between staff and guests, between families and neighbors, because now there was permission to speak plainly. Arthur found his son and took him aside. "I wanted you to see what is behind the doors," he said to James, not reproachful, but bearing the weight of one who had learned something he wished he had taught sooner. James listened and then hugged his father with a kind of awkward affection that felt like a start. As the evening wound down and guests drifted toward cars and waiting rides, Sarah found herself approached by someone she had not expected, a young woman from another charity organization who had been invited as a guest. "I overheard about the fund," she said. "We might be able to coordinate training programs. People who want to grow shouldn't have to pay for the first step." The words felt like the hinge of a new door. Sarah looked at the gardener, Arthur, standing again near the hedges, like a man who had done a necessary thing, and saw that whatever secret he had kept had led to public good. She thought of Molly, asleep in a neighbor's spare room, dreaming of twirls and applause that would be earned and not bought. She thought of the small, steady dignity of being counted.
In the days that followed, the Langley Foundation released a modest plan, not an ostentatious deed, but a careful investment. Staff got improved contracts, childcare subsidies were announced, a small scholarship program opened for the children of employees.
Arthur requested that a committee be formed with staff representation to advise on events to prevent the kind of oversight that had led to the earlier tensions. The foundation's offerings were tempered with practical constraints, no promises that would overreach, no instant fixes that could not be sustained. They were, however, intentionally structured to address the most immediate vulnerabilities. The staff received the news with a mix of gratitude and guarded optimism. People who had been at the margins of the social map suddenly had the possibility of a small horizon extension. Grace did not erase years of cautious living, but it provided scaffolding. Sarah met with a foundation representative who was practical and kind. "We want to do this right," the representative said. "We want to respect your dignity. If you prefer a job opportunity with leadership potential, we can offer training. If you prefer to keep your current role with reliable hours, we can guarantee that. We can also assist with a small fund from Molly's dance classes." Sarah responded with a clarity that had been earned by years of making hard choices. "I don't want to be rescued," she said. "I want opportunity. I want stability. I want my kid to see that work can make a life, not just pay a bill. If you can help make that real, I will accept." Over the next months, the changes were tangible if slow. The event company where Sarah worked instituted new policies. Wages improved, schedules were posted sooner, and staff had a voice in planning events. Harold was promoted to a training role where he could pass on his decades of wisdom to new hires. Mr. Wilson became an advocate for treating workers as partners rather than props. Amanda, after a period of reflection, became an ally to the staff, and in time she worked to shift procedures that had turned kindness into a forgivable offense. Vivian called Sarah one afternoon, not with diamonds or apologies, but with a small bouquet of roses she herself had chosen. "You taught me something about noticing," she said. "I wanted to say thank you for showing me." The bouquet cost little in the ledger of rich lives and meant a great deal to the woman who had been learning to accept attention without turning it into a spectacle. Arthur visited sometimes after the initial excitement. He and Sarah spoke, sometimes about practical things, education, schedules, community projects, and sometimes about small, ordinary things, rain, roses, the way the city smelled in winter. Their relationship was not a romance. It was an awkward human friendship between two people who had met at a point of mutual honesty and shared care. Arthur was careful to maintain boundaries, to acknowledge the asymmetry of his position, and to ensure that his assistance never felt like a purchase of affection. There were whispers about the reveal. Some argued it had been manipulative. Others called it compassionate justice. The conversations were messy and imperfect. But something had changed in the culture of the people who worked in that place. Language toward staff softened. Meetings began with a few minutes to check on people rather than only on logistics, and small acts of thoughtfulness multiplied like seedlings. For Sarah, the biggest change was not the envelopes or the training opportunities, but the freedom to plan without the constant stomach twist of uncertainty. She signed a contract that guaranteed her stable hours and a path to a supervisory role should she choose to pursue it. The scholarship fund paid for Molly's dance classes for 2 years and provided a small cushion for emergencies. The provision was not an instant fix for all of life's complexity. Rent still had to be paid, nights were sometimes long, and worries came in the way of leaks and slow buses. But the steadying effect of a reliable promise made space for other things: rest, planning, the ability to say yes to Molly's recital without mental arithmetic. The gardener's influence continued as well.
Arthur accepted an invitation to publicly speak at a small community roundtable about the value of labor and the dignity of work. He did not take a pedestal. Instead, he listened to the stories of cleaners who saved for a child's college book, listened to caterers who had been working 2 jobs to keep a small business afloat. He used his resources not as a weapon or a halo, but as tools for scaffolding, funds targeted at predictable needs, training partnered with local institutions, and an insistence that those who worked be included in decisions that affected them. As months turned, small reputations shifted. People who once took their cues from social lineages began to ask different questions. Who tends your garden? Who feeds your party? The questions were simple, and sometimes people were embarrassed to be late learners. That embarrassment is a good place for humility to take root if it finds fertile ground. Sarah, for her part, began to teach a small evening class at a community center about event logistics, how to plan a menu that fits budgets, how to negotiate with a caterer when funds are scarce, how to make a modest event feel welcoming. She taught not from a place of superiority, but of practical generosity. Students who came to her class found a teacher who could translate the jargon of high-end events into tools that fit modest budgets. Molly, when not at dance, came to class sometimes and learned that there were many ways to be part of a world that once seemed unwelcome. The gardener, Arthur, when he was himself and not the man in the jacket, continued to visit the garden in the quiet hours. He welcomed Harold's company and found in the steady rhythm of pruning and planting a new kind of repair. He had not set out to be a savior. He had set out to be curious. The discovery that one's curiosity could lead to communal repair was both humbling and instructive.
There was one moment later that sealed the evening in Sarah's memory. A year after the wedding, on a crisp autumn morning, a dedication plaque was unveiled at the garden where the wedding had been held. It was small and modest, a piece of polished wood set near the path. The plaque did not boast of grand gestures. It read simply, with plain font, "For those who tend the earth and each other." The inscription was not signed with a single name, but with the names of staff and volunteers who had worked there that season. Harold's name was first, Sarah's followed. Molly's name was there too, not as a patron's child, but as a participant, someone who had danced in the garden and learned that being seen can mean being known. At the dedication, Arthur spoke briefly. "I learned that status can be a hindrance to seeing," he said, "and I learned that seeing is the beginning of repair." He did not provide theatrical absolution. He offered a simple truth: dignity is built by the actions of many, not the pronouncements of a few. People who had been proud apologized genuinely in small moments. People who had been hurt found pathways to repair. The institution where Sarah worked kept the new policies in place and added an advisory seat for staff. The foundation's plan was adjusted to be sustainable and community-led. None of this erased the past, but it set a different course. Sometimes, when evening fell and the garden smelled of turned earth and the faint perfume of roses, Sarah would walk the paths in no uniform. She would place a hand on a trellis and feel the living patience of things that grow slowly but surely. She would look at the lights over the path, where once guests had tightened their collars and measured each other, and she would smile at the quiet knowledge that small acts can ripple. Arthur continued to be a guest in lives he did not own. He learned that privilege, when used rightly, is less about control and more about clearing a way for others to stride. For him, the real lesson was quieter than he had anticipated. You cannot purchase humility. You can only practice it. He practiced by listening, by attending meetings with staff rather than directors alone, and by learning to speak with a voice that was not the only voice. James and his father found a new language. They were still imperfect. They had disagreements about money and biography and what it means to be responsible. But they learned something else. Not every plan needed the imprimatur of what social standing could buy. Sometimes the best plans started with a question: who among us is not being seen? In the end, the title that had hung in the air, the poor gardener at the wedding, became a caution to people who loved appearances. The man with dirt under his nails was not poor in the only ways that mattered. He was wealthy in crucial things: integrity, steadiness, the habit of bending.
The real surprise was not that a wealthy man had concealed himself. The surprise was that the world can change when someone dares to step out of a place of comfort and notice those who stand in the shade. Sarah's life did change, not by a miraculous overnight transformation, but by steady, practical lifting. Molly's dance classes continued. The rent was still a worry sometimes, but less often. Harold trained a new generation of gardeners who not only cared for roses, but also understood the dignity of their craft. Mr. Wilson's team became an exemplar of respectful operations, and Amanda started a small forum for event staff to be included in planning. Vivian learned to ask before she judged. Small things multiplied. One afternoon, months after the wedding, Arthur walked the garden and found Sarah kneeling by a bed of roses. He sat on the bench nearby, and she looked up without surprise. They kept each other company in comfortable silence for a while. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, suddenly, not long into their quiet. Arthur considered the question. He thought of the nights he had spent watching people, the small embarrassments, the uncomfortable shifts in his son's face, the apologies offered by people who had finally learned to see. "Sometimes it was messy," he admitted, "but the mess taught me more about how to be useful than any ledgers did." Sarah listened and nodded. "You could have told me," she said softly. He nodded. "I could have. I'm sorry I didn't. I learned that lesson the slower, harder way. I wanted to see things as they were, but I should have honored your right not to be part of a study without your knowledge." She touched a petal feathered with rain. "I was angry," she said, "but not at you so much as at being made small by myself." A laugh escaped her, honest and warm. "I'm glad it led somewhere." "And I'm glad you didn't pull the roses out of spite for the soil," Arthur replied. They both smiled. Two people who had been unmade and remade in the same afternoon. When the sun lowered and the garden took on the golden glow that makes ordinary things look sacred, Sarah rose and brushed her hands. "Come see Molly dance sometime," she invited. "I would like that," Arthur said, and meant it. They parted with a small wave, the kind that seals a new pact, to act without seeking applause and to accept help when it is offered with respect. The garden settled behind them into the dusk, a quiet witness to the ways lives can be reshaped by small acts of tending. In the years that followed, the story of the wedding spread not as scandal, but as a parable told over cups of coffee and in church basements and corporate meetings where people tried to figure out how to pair profit with humility. People repeated the line with different inflections, some as a congratulation, some as a warning. But the heart of the story stayed the same. True position is determined by the sizes of our sympathies, not the numbers in our accounts.
And so the last piece of advice that found its way into most retellings was not about wealth or deception, but about practice. Look for the people who tend the edges of your life. They often teach the most important lessons. Never judge a gardener by his gloves, the story concluded, because gloves hide hands that have learned to make things grow. If this story blessed you, subscribe for more parables that remind us how small acts can change lives, and share it with someone who could use a reminder that dignity matters. Who in your life needs to be seen today?